The Passenger and Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy. This one's been a long time coming, both for Cormac McCarthy and me. Cormac McCarthy because I believe he started writing this novel, or these two novels, back in the 70s. And for me, because I was a little bit intimidated by it. I wasn't quite sure how to begin, what it was all about. Now, I'm not sure really many people know what this novel is about, or these two novels are about, but I have some ideas, especially when you consider where Cormac McCarthy is in his life, and that being the end of his life. He's 89 years old at the time of this recording, and I think in that context, the novel makes a lot of sense. Of course, I can't make complete sense of it, but I will do my best in this review, and I really thought it was important to review these two books together, not separately. I wasn't sure if Stella Maris was a sequel or something else. The description online says it is a companion book, and I think that's probably the best way you could describe it. I equate it to something like the DVD, or for you younger folks out there, Blu-ray extras. If you guys even know what Blu-rays are, it's not necessary to read if you don't want to after The Passenger, but it does give more context. It's from the POV of the protagonist's sister. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about what is the hook? What is The Passenger and Stella Maris about? The Passenger is about a man named Robert Western, or Bobby Western as he goes by in most of the book. He has a very colored past. He's a Caltech dropout. He's very gifted at mathematics, not as gifted as his sister Alicia, who I'll talk about very shortly. He went over to Europe to race cars, and now he finds himself in the south of the United States as a salvage diver. He's also very troubled by the death of his sister Alicia, who we learn about on the very first page, as well as his father, who was partly responsible for the creation of the atomic bomb. But on one of these dives, Bobby Western goes to a downed plane to investigate, and he comes to find out a little bit later that there is a missing passenger aboard, hence the title of the novel. And after this discovery, two men approach him at his apartment. We don't know if they're FBI, some kind of government agent, detectives even, and we never learn. But they think Bobby knows something about this missing passenger. And needless to say, they turn his life upside down. But this book is really more than that. Like I said, it's about him mourning the loss of his sister, in fact, being haunted by it, as well as so many other things. But I'll talk about more of that in the plot. Let's talk about what Stella Maris is about. It's about Bobby Western's sister, Alicia Western. She has schizophrenia, allegedly. She checks herself into Stella Maris, which is a mental institution. And really this entire book is a conversation between her and a psychiatrist. And through this conversation, or these conversations, I should say, you also learn the things that haunt her. The love of her brother, which I will get into a little bit later. Her father, of course, and her own madness. So what did I think? Well, let us talk about character. Let's talk about Bobby Western first, the protagonist of The Passenger. He feels a little bit like Llewellyn Moss. He feels a little bit like, a man's man, like many Cormac McCarthy protagonists, but he does have some other layers. He's very gifted with mathematics. He has very philosophical conversations with some of the characters in this book, as well as scientific ones. And he's also desperately in love with his sister. Yeah, that way. And so you can see he's already doomed, right? They're both tragic characters. And what's interesting about Bobby is that he kind of straddles the line between an academic, in a way. You can see it in his mind through the conversations he has, but also as a man's man. He's surviving off the land in parts of this book, wandering, saying some very matter-of-fact things that definitely make you think. But aside from Bobby, there's a very colorful cast of characters here. So there is John Shedan, or John Shedan. I didn't listen to the audiobook, so I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but he is an interesting character, one of Bobby's old friends who he meets up with to have dinner and talk very philosophical things, very scientific things. This is where you can see Cormac McCarthy's love for the sciences on the page, the first time that I believe I've ever witnessed it. And there's another character that really stands out to me. I wish I could remember his name, but let's just say they get up to some hillbilly antics, which I found myself laughing out loud many times during these encounters. And the voices of these characters are so unique, and it always gives me pause as a writer when I'm reading Cormac McCarthy's characters at how varied they can be, even though they feel like they live in the same small area. We also meet his grandmother and his very troubled uncle, and that was one of my favorite parts of the novel. But Bobby and these side characters aren't the only characters, of course. There's Alicia Western, his sister. What's interesting about her is she's an absolute genius. I mean, like crazy genius with mathematics. She went to university, I think, when she was 12 or 13. There's mentions of her reading books all day in Stella Maris, and she in fact says she doesn't forget anything because why else would you read? She's also doing math when she's not sitting down doing math. She's always doing math. She's plagued by her genius, essentially. But more than that, she's plagued by what she calls these horts, or these cohorts, which are these hallucinations. There's one called the thalidomide kid, who is a dwarf-like creature with a scarred head and hands that are kind of like flippers. He's very deformed, hence the name thalidomide kid. And these sections actually were the most surprising to me because it had such a youthful voice, a zany voice, a crazy voice, something I've never seen Cormac McCarthy write. And these passages with these hallucinations exist at the beginning of every chapter, the entire thing being italicized. However, these do taper off about halfway into the book. Speaking about Alicia, we get a deeper look at her character in Stella Maris because obviously it's a conversation, so we get much more insight to who she is and how she thinks. And what it really reminded me of is I read a book a long time ago by Michael Shermer. It's called The Believing Brain. And he argues that there's a very fine line between genius and madness. He calls out people, brilliant physicists by name in the book, who on one hand are making these extraordinary scientific discoveries, and on the other hand, they think there are alien green raccoons in their backyard. And the way he explains this is through patterns. So as humans, we are wired to see patterns. That's why we see faces in everything. And he says that these people, these geniuses, and the reason why they are bordering madness, if not mad, is because they can just see more patterns. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong. Obviously, the hallucinations are wrong, but the scientific discoveries are right. And so while I was reading the conversation between the psychiatrist and Alicia, that really came to mind because you can see she's very tortured and she hides behind a demeanor, a very sarcastic demeanor, actually. But you can see she lets this wall down from time to time during these discussions. And I think it's also worth noting that this is the first female protagonist that Cormac McCarthy's ever written. And so what did I think of that? Honestly, I don't want to say I was disappointed, but I also wasn't very impressed. While listening to Alicia speak, you could kind of figure her out a little bit, right? It didn't seem like she was super complex, and maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe Cormac McCarthy wasn't trying to do anything crazy. Maybe he was trying to lay out the fact that she is just seeing all of these patterns, like I was saying. She is just so smart that she is crazy, essentially. But there is one thing she does profess, and that is the love for her brother. And yes, it's the kind of love you're thinking or dreading, incestuous love. And she pursued it more than he did, even though they both loved each other. But I feel like this love sort of transcends genetics and the taboos therein. I know, maybe this is the beauty of Cormac McCarthy's writing, the genius of Alicia herself convincing me as such, because I think in any other circumstance you would be repulsed. But I really wasn't. The way he handled that love was accessible, for lack of a better word. It was tender, it wasn't trying to be controversial, it just was what it was. So I know I'm meandering in character a little bit, but there's really a lot to be talked about. Bobby, of course, is haunted by this love, and I think even more than that, but these two things go hand in hand, the love for his sister, because at the beginning of The Passenger, we know she's dead. We don't know how she dies. In fact, we don't really ever completely know how she dies, but that's not the point. The point is, she was just literally too big for this world, and maybe to a degree he was as well. All right, let's move on to the plot. So I don't want to spoil anything here, and there's far less to talk about with Stella Maris because it is a conversation, like I said. It's just a transcript of her final days at Stella Maris, Alicia, that is. The plot of The Passenger is where things get a little odd. I think it's where it can lose people because it's not about plot. Yes, there is a plot, and it kind of ebbs and flows. So like I said, he, after discovering this missing passenger, he's confronted by these two men who we never really learn of. But then they start following him, tracking him down, making his life miserable, ruining his life even. But then that plot just kind of falls out for, I'd say, like at least a third of the book, if not more. And then we learn about his grandfather and his uncle. And like I said earlier, that's probably one of my favorite parts of the book. But those of you out there looking for a satisfying plot or a satisfying conclusion, or really a coherent plot whatsoever, you're not going to find that here. This is the story of a man who is haunted, like I keep repeating over and over again, by his father's involvement with the creation of the atomic bomb, the loss of his sister, the love of his sister. And it seems like on all fronts, his life is literally crumbling around him. And there really is no solid resolution whatsoever. And that brings me back to Cormac McCarthy at the end of his life. These two books could be his last. He's 89 years old, like I said. Maybe these two books he'd been holding on, because if he started writing them in the 70s and the 80s, maybe he didn't feel like he was quite ready to explore the things that he wanted to explore with this. Not only maybe learning more about mathematics and the sciences, but also life itself. Because if you really read this book in the context or through the lens of a man at the very end of his life, you can see that he's trying to say something. And of course, I know Cormac McCarthy is trying to say something in every one of his novels. He is a masterful writer, but really the lack of plot resolution or just the very uneven plot itself makes me wonder if these two books have that even more so. The feeling I got from reading this book is that life is not planned. Life is not plotted like a book. Sometimes we try to plan, sometimes we try to plot, but it doesn't always work out the way we thought. And that's exactly more or less how this book ends up. And so I don't know if he was trying to say that. He was purposely creating this plot that kind of meandered, kind of went nowhere, kind of dissolved almost into nothing, because that's reality. And of course, fiction is not reality, but we know that he explores so many themes through his writing, just like any good writer out there. And so that's just really what hit me while reading this book. All right, let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This is more accessible Cormac McCarthy. This is a little bit more No Country for Old Men, quite a bit less Blood Meridian, even though there are very long, very deep conversations, philosophical ones, scientific ones that kind of, I hate to say this, but bored me a little bit. And I should have talked about this in the plot, but these are the things that I didn't like so much. Don't get me wrong, I love thinking about stuff like that, but rather than having it spelled out in a conversation, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of subtext here, but when it's drawn out, when it's in such detail, when it's literally a man expressing his love for the sciences on the page, in dialogue, it gets a little bit dry. This happens both in Stella Maris and The Passenger. So these were kind of the bumps in the road for me, right? The potholes, essentially. It kind of reminded me of when you're talking to somebody about something you don't really have much interest in. You're kind of glazing over a little bit. I found myself glazing over these bits because, again, I think fiction is a great medium to describe ideas, to communicate ideas. But sometimes when it's literally there in that kind of format, it can be a little bit dry unless you are very into that kind of thing. But more about the writing, I think it's important to mention that The Passenger has italicized text. It's really from the POV or the experiences of Alicia, her last days, of course, and you're going to find these at the very beginning of each chapter, not every single chapter, because it eventually ends at about 2/3 of the way through, I believe. But I think for me, writing-wise, the thing that stood out the most to me, in a great way, was the way he handled flashbacks. It was just amazing. That's all the way I can describe it. He seamlessly dipped into the past, to the point where I got a little confused. And you may argue that that is bad form, but it was so seamless, so hypnotic, that I did have to go back and say, wait, did I miss something? But again, I'm a writer, so I try to look at things closely to learn from them. And so maybe you would not be stopped in your tracks, but just know that the way he navigates through time is completely masterful, and it's amazing to me that he has not showed his entire hand yet, right? Through all of these years, he has not showed us all of his tricks. Another thing I'd like to mention about the writing, and this is very classic, typical Cormac McCarthy, is how little he needs to use narrative description. So a lot of times in novels, you're reading dialogue and you'll say, oh, he shrugged, or he put his hands in his pockets, or he looked down, and then continue on with the dialogue. You're trying to create a visual experience for the reader. Somehow, Cormac McCarthy does all of that without doing that. It's crazy. I can vividly picture the actions of these characters, the way they're sitting, the way they're looking at each other, little cues in the dialogue even that describe things of a visual nature within the scene. And of course, with Stella Maris, the entire thing being dialogue, it's even more impressive that way, because I don't think I've ever read a book like this. I'm sure if you've read transcripts, it's going to feel very familiar. But even still, reading these two go back and forth in Stella Maris, you can see them tearing up, being uncomfortable, laughing even. And I think to me, that is one of the most impressive things craft-wise that Cormac McCarthy is capable of in his writing. With all that said, I'm going to have to give The Passenger and Stella Maris, at the time of this recording anyway, because I know I'm going to have to go back and read this book, or these books, because these beg to be revisited, an 8 out of 10. A plot that some may argue is uneven, broken, unsatisfying, but I feel is done very purposefully, because of course who we're dealing with, a master of his craft. Characterization that is second to none. and beautiful writing that will suck you in, but also may bore you from time to time. Unless you're into physics, philosophy, things like that, which I know if you're reading Cormac McCarthy, you probably are. And I think in the hands of a lesser writer, I would probably give this a lower score. And I know that sounds pretentious. That may sound unfair, but if you've ever listened to an interview with Cormac McCarthy, you'll know what I mean. He's very careful about what he says. In fact, I listened to an interview with Lawrence Krauss, who's I believe he's an astrophysicist, and Cormac McCarthy, and they were talking about his book. Krauss brought up the conversation between Bobby Western and his grandmother. And he said, so this scene, Bobby is talking to his grandmother, and Cormac McCarthy immediately stopped him and said, no, talking at his grandmother. You can tell with that small interjection that literally every single word is scrutinized by Mr. McCarthy. He does not throw words on the page willy-nilly. Every little thing has intention. And the irony of that entire interview is it does feel like Lawrence Krauss is talking at Cormac McCarthy, not talking to him, because he, let's say, dominates the conversation. Not that Cormac McCarthy is one who is a very talkative man, especially in interviews. But that is the review. I hope you enjoyed it. This is something, like I said, I'm going to have to return to. But I would love to hear, have you read this book? Have you read these two books? What did you think? Am I way off base? Do I think I'm giving Cormac McCarthy too much credit for the plot that seemed to just kind of fall to pieces? Or was it all part of a master plan? If you'd like to see my own work, you can check out my novels in the description below. Thanks for hanging out with me as always, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.